The car market is in a state of limbo. We know this based on wholesale data from July, as well as the quarterly reports that we've seen from Q2 of this year. But the newest data that we have per Cox Automotive shows us that some automakers are having a really hard time selling cars. So let's dig in. As of July, the average listing price remains high at $47,307, and according to data released today by Kelley Blue Book, the average transaction price for a new vehicle is currently $48,401. So $47,303 is the actual price that vehicles are being listed for, and $48,401 is what vehicles are actually being sold for. This includes things like tax, title, licensing, and dealership incentives. According to the data, compact and subcompact vehicles are becoming increasingly popular, and 1 out of every 4 vehicles sold fall into this category. Unfortunately, as of July, there was only one single vehicle that you could buy for brand new for under $20,000, and that was the Mitsubishi Mirage, which is unfortunately getting discontinued later this year. So it looks as though after the Mirage goes away, there aren't going to be any cars that are under 20 grand, which is disappointing. And according to the data, expensive full-size pickup trucks really can be to blame for why the average vehicle transaction price is so high, and it's really driving that price up. For both the average vehicle listing price and the average transaction price, prices were relatively flat from June to July, which is really interesting because there were other aspects of the car market that saw some extreme volatility between June and July of this year. And this could mean a few different things, and it could be because of a few different things. Truthfully, it could mean nothing, because as we've spoken about multiple times on this channel, the CDK outage, which plagued dealerships in the month of June, where hackers hacked into CDK, which is a widely used software service for dealerships, and they caused havoc throughout the entire automotive industry. This not only affected automotive sales, but it also affected how these sales were reported, definitely throwing off the data for June, but even throwing it off for July and even into August. Because for reference, days supply in the month of June was 116 days, but in July it was 68 days, or 2.79 million units of inventory. And so does that mean that new car inventory actually dropped by 43% between June and July? Probably not. In fact, almost certainly not. But even taking June out of the equation, day supply was still down in July for May, in July sitting at 68 days and in May sitting at 74 days. So that is absolutely a noteworthy decline. And that means that sales in the month of July were smaller relative to demand compared to May. Now, as I mentioned earlier, while prices from June to July were relatively flat, the silver lining here is that dealership incentives were actually up. And whenever we look at the historical data of dealership incentives, they've actually gone up by quite a bit, which is a great thing. Average incentives in July rose to 7% of the average transaction price, $3,383, which is up from the 6.4% that we saw in June, and is the largest amount of dealership incentives that we've seen in 2024. In fact, the largest that we've seen in a long time. And dealership incentives are up by 59.1% compared to a year ago, which is huge, and it really shows the improvement and the changes that have been going on in the car market over the last year. Really good news. This really shows how dealerships are having to lower prices in order to incentivize demand and to keep those sales coming through. And it also really solidifies something that we talked about on this channel dozens, if not hundreds of times, which is that in this current car market, there is absolutely no excuse to ever pay above MSRP. But if we want to look at this scenario from a bit of a half glass empty lens, then it's also important to acknowledge the fact that in some ways this could be a little bit disappointing, because despite the fact that dealership incentives have gone up by 59% in the last year and are up to 7% of the average vehicle transaction price, vehicle transaction prices are still relatively flat. And so even though dealership incentives have gone up, they haven't really gone up enough to compensate for the fact that vehicle prices are still far too high. Definitely not something that isn't unexpected, but it is still a bummer to see nonetheless. Now let's take a look at some of the different inventory levels for these different automakers and to see which types of automakers have inventory stacking up while which ones don't. And spoiler alert, many of these trends are trends that we've seen before.
I think I've seen this film before, and I didn't like the ending.
If we take a look here at dealership inventory by brand, you can see that Toyota, Lexus, and Honda all have the lowest inventory of any other automaker. But you can see that this inventory has been climbing, particularly with Honda, which now has 43-day supply. Toyota, on the other hand, is still extremely low with a 29-day supply. Now, I mentioned earlier that the average day supply of inventory is 68 days. And Chevy, Infiniti, Mazda, Hyundai, and Nissan are all hovering very, very closely to that national average, with Hyundai sitting at 68 days, which is the national average. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you can see that Volvo, Alfa Romeo, Jeep, Dodge, Jaguar, Lincoln, and Ram all have a ton of inventory, with Lincoln and Ram specifically having more than twice the industry average of inventory. And across this, you can see that many of these automakers have one thing in common, which is their parent company, and that is Stellantis. Of the top 5 highest inventory automakers, 3 come from the Stellantis brand, being Jeep, Dodge, and Ram. And of the top 10 highest inventory automakers, 5 of them come from Stellantis. Now, one thing that I think is incredibly interesting, and I absolutely have to point it out, and that is an automaker that has never been featured on this graph before, and that is Ferrari, which really caught me by surprise. I have been following new inventory data from Cox Automotive for an extremely long time, and never have I seen a brand that falls into the exotic category featured on this list, let alone Ferrari. So I was very surprised to see it featured this month. I was even more surprised to see how much inventory Ferrari has sitting around. And you can see here that according to Cox Automotive, Ferrari has 97 days supply, which shockingly falls in the top 10 automakers with the highest inventory, beating out not only other expensive brands like Mercedes and Audi, but even beating out normal everyday brands like Kia and Subaru. Now, when it comes to buying a car, it's important to pay attention to inventory levels because it can oftentimes be indicative of what type of discount you can get from these automakers. But one thing that I have noticed in this current car market is that inventory levels aren't as important as they once were whenever it comes down to discounts. Sure, the automakers with the highest levels of inventory, so Jeep, Dodge, Lincoln, Ram, they are most likely going to give the steepest discounts. But even brands that have lower amounts of inventory, they are also giving out discounts as well. But chances are, if you have a very specific niche vehicle that you want, and you want it with one of these lower inventory automakers, you may have a harder time getting that car due to the lower inventory, but you should still be able to get a discount. But of course, those discounts will vary based off of that inventory. But I suppose what I'm saying is that if you're looking to buy a car from brands like Honda, Toyota, or Lexus, absolutely do not accept MSRP, because even these automakers with the lowest amounts of inventory are in fact giving discounts and offering incentives, while the higher inventory automakers are as well, but at a bit of a higher level. But one thing that is becoming abundantly clear here is that the automakers with the large inventory, well, they need to get their act together. I'm looking at you, Stellantis and Lincoln. Like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video.